The following account was compiled in the autumn of 1923 by Professor Harmon Veach of the University of Idaho's Department of Folklore and Regional Studies. The dossier designated Case Study 9 in his unpublished manuscript Abrant Encounters of the Intermountain West consists of 4 primary sources: the private farm journal of one Elias Henderson, a supplementary account written by his wife, Clara, a formal statement attributed to their eldest son, Thomas, and a sheriff's incident report filed by Aldist Crane of Later County. Professor Veach's editorial annotations appear throughout, marked in a different ink, a darker blue shade that he apparently reserved for his most considered observations. These annotations are reproduced here exactly as written, including several which by the document's final pages grow noticeably shorter. Veach's introduction to the dossier reads in part as follows. The Henderson materials were brought to my attention in the spring of 1921 by a former student who had taken a teaching post in Moscow, Idaho. In the course of a school assignment on regional history, this student had interviewed a retired farmer who mentioned, without elaboration, that his neighbor's family had experienced in the winter of 1905 a series of disturbances so severe that they abandoned a homestead they had occupied for 11 years. The family had relocated to Lewin and declined thereafter to speak of the matter. My student noted the peculiarity and forwarded what little he had gathered. I spent the following 2 years reconstructing what I could. What Veach reconstructed is reproduced here in full. The reader should understand from the outset that these sources have not been independently verified, that the events they describe carry no official explanation on record, and that Elias Henderson himself never gave a formal account to any institution beyond the single report his son filed with the county sheriff. Henderson wrote only in his private journal in the hours after his work was done, and the journal was never meant to be read by anyone living. That fact, the complete privacy of its composition, is perhaps the most unusual credential it carries. If testimonies like this one belong in the record, consider subscribing to Vile Vault. There are more files where this one originated, and not all of them have been fully examined. Elias Henderson's journal begins, for the purposes of this account, with an entry dated the 6th of November, 1905. The weeks preceding this date are occupied with ordinary concerns: the price of wheat, a dispute with a neighboring family over a fence line, the condition of the barn's north wall before snowfall, the cost of a new harness. Veach notes that the handwriting in these earlier entries is regular and unhurried, the script of a man accustomed to accounting for his days without anxiety. The entry for November 6th reads in full. Something got into the hen house last night. Found 3 birds dead this morning. Not eaten, just killed. No tracks I could make sense of in the mud around the foundation. Thought at first it was a weasel, but a weasel doesn't leave a bird untouched after killing it. Patched the gap under the east wall. Clara says she heard something around 3 o'clock in the morning. I slept through it. The entry for November 9th is longer and the handwriting is marginally less settled. Found the gap under the east wall torn open again. Not pulled open. Torn. The boards were bent outward from the inside edge of the frame, as if something had pushed through from the exterior with considerable force. Killed 2 more hens. Thomas walked the perimeter of the hen house with me after breakfast. He found what he took at first for a handprint in the frost on the side of the feeding trough. Large. Flattened. The fingers spread wide. We measured it against my own hand. It was 4 in longer from heel to tit, and the proportions were wrong in a way that is difficult to put into writing. The spacing between the finger impressions was too wide. The angle of the thumb impression, if that is what it was off. I told Thomas it was probably a bear coming down early from the northern timber. Thomas did not say anything to that. He looked at the impression for a long moment, and then he went to tend the horse. He knows as well as I do that a bear does not leave a handprint shaped like that. It is worth pausing here to establish the geography of the Henderson property. The farm sat approximately 4 miles north of the nearest neighboring property and 14 miles from the town of Potlatch. The northern boundary of the Henderson land terminated at a dense stand of old-growth ponderosa pine. Trees that had stood by conservative estimate 300 to 400 years, their trunks wider than a man can embrace. Their interlocked canopy so thick that even in winter their understory remained dim at midday. Beyond that treeline the land rose steeply into the Paloux Hills and then into territory that in 1905 remained largely unsurveyed by any official body. Vetch notes that the NEZ Paus referred to the specific ridge above the Henderson property as a place to be avoided, though the precise nature of the avoidance and the name they applied to the ridge was not recorded in any source available to him. The notation is brief. He does not pursue it. The disturbances continued through the third week of November. Henderson's journal records them with the systematic brevity of a man trying to impose order on events that resisted. The horse is found one morning with its stall door forced, not unlatched, but forced. The iron bracket bent 40 degrees out of true. The wood of the door frame compressed inward around the striker plate, as if something had pushed against it with sustained and deliberate pressure. 2 days later, a section of the northern fence line is found collapsed, not broken, not knocked, but pulled from the frozen ground. Posts extracted root and all and set aside, placed not thrown, aligned in a rough row alongside the gap they had occupied, as if whatever removed them had done so to create a passage, and intended to remember where the passage was. Vetch sanitation here is the longest in the document's early sections. The displacement of the fence posts distinguishes this account from standard large predator incursion. He writes, "No natural predator known to this region removes a physical obstacle and sets it aside. This behavior implies at minimum a problem-solving intelligence." Henderson's own assessment of this specific detail is notably absent from his journal. He describes it with precision and then moves on without comment. Whether this represents the stoicism of a practical man, or the particular silence of a man who does not want to reach the conclusion his evidence is pointing him toward, is not clear. Possibly it is both. Clara Henderson's account, a letter of some 14 pages addressed to no specific recipient, composed in Lewin in the spring of 1906, apparently as an act of private testimony, and never sent, offers a dimension of the record that her husband's journal does not. Where Elias catalogues events in the language of a farmer recording crop yields, Clara interprets, and what she interprets is sound. The sound that her husband, she writes, could not bring himself to put into words because he did not know how to write it and retain his authority as the head of the household. "I have no such authority to protect," she writes, "and so I will write it plainly. It was not a howl." Clara insists in the letter's second section. "I had lived on that property for 11 years. Wolves came through twice in that time, and I heard them both times, in summer and in winter, and I know the full range of what a wolf produces. This was something else entirely. It was lower than a howl, and much longer. It could sustain itself for a minute and a half without interruption, and in a good wind it was audible from inside the house with the shutters latched. What separated it from every animal sound I had ever encountered was a quality I can only describe as deliberateness. The way a man clears his throat before he speaks in a room where he wants to be certain he has been heard. It came from the northern tree in each time. Always before dawn, always in the window of deepest dark between 3 o'clock in the morning and the first gray of pre-dawn. I began after the third night to lie awake, waiting for it. I counted the seconds of each occurrence. It never lasted fewer than 40 seconds, and never more than 90. It was not a creature losing itself to impulse. It was pacing itself. Thomas Henderson's formal statement, 3 pages, composed at Veitch's specific request in 1923, 18 years after the events, is the document that Veitch identifies in his introduction as the record's turning point. Thomas was 17 years old in the winter of 1905. He begins his account by acknowledging that 18 years have not altered what he recollects, and that he had allowed himself to hope they might. The first time I saw it clearly, Thomas writes, was the 22nd of November. Father had asked me to check the horse before I turned in for the night. I took the lantern from the kitchen peg and crossed the yard. The temperature had dropped sharply in the afternoon, and the mud had frozen hard as iron. I remember the sound my boots made on the ice crust, a short cracking with each step. That is the kind of detail you remember. I was roughly 10 feet from the barn door when I stopped. The lantern light spread to the edge of the yard, and no further. Beyond the edge of the light, at the Treeline, something was standing. I say standing because that was precisely what it was doing. Not crouching, not moving, standing in the manner of a man who is watching something and who has no particular concern about whether he is seen or not. It was the size of a tall man, or it carried the proportion of a man. It had 2 legs bearing its weight, 2 arms at its sides, shoulders of a width consistent with an adult male. But it was wrong in the way that a figure in difficult light is sometimes wrong, where you cannot name the specific quality of the wrongness, but you feel it at once in the body, before the mind has processed the image. I stood still for what I estimate was 4 minutes, perhaps a little more. It stood still for the entire time. It did not move and it did not make a sound. The horse inside the barn was completely silent. I did not realize this until I had been standing there for perhaps 2 minutes. Horses do not go silent in cold weather. They shift weight and blow. They make the small sounds of large animals at rest. The horse made nothing. I heard nothing from inside that barn except the wind against the boards. When I finally turned to go back to the house, I heard it move, not toward me, away, back toward and then into the Treeline. The sound it made moving through snow was wrong in a way that I have never been able to adequately describe. Too heavy for a man, too measured for an animal. Each step was placed rather than fallen. Veitch's annotation to this passage extends across a full page of his dossier. He cross-references the observation behavior, the sustained unmoving watch from a fixed position with 11 other accounts from the Intermountain West and Pacific Northwest spanning the period between 1871 and 1919. In 8 of those 11 accounts, the entity was reported specifically in the pre-dawn hours, not at midnight, not in the depth of early evening, but in the narrow band between approximately 3 o'clock in the morning and the first pale suggestion of light. He notes that this pattern does not align with what the dominant folklore traditions of the region would predict, and that the Henderson family showed no apparent awareness of those traditions. He underlines this observation twice. He does not interpret it. The family moved through the final week of November in a condition that Elias's journal records with his characteristic compression. We are all sleeping poorly. The work continues. I'm not sure why. Clara's letter is considerably more specific about that week's character. She had begun leaving the kitchen lamp burning through the entire night. She stopped sleeping between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning. She sat instead in the kitchen chair she had positioned facing the window, The north-facing window, the one with a clear line of sight toward the pine ridge, with the lamp at her right elbow. Her Bible open on the table and the long-handled fireplace iron across her knees. I do not know what I intended to do with the iron. She writes, by that point in November, I think I understood at some level I was not permitting myself to examine directly that the iron would not have been of much practical use. But a woman has to hold something in the dark. On the 28th of November, Elias sent Thomas into Potlatch with the supply wagon. At the bottom of the supply list, in a hand that Vetch describes as pressed harder into the paper than his usual script, Henderson had written a single additional instruction: speak with Sheriff Crane. The journal entry does not explain why Henderson did not make the trip himself. He remained on the property. Veitch observes, without elaborating, that this decision was either an act of stubbornness or an act of custody. A man who did not intend to leave his land and his wife unattended, even to seek help. Sheriff Aldous Crane's incident report dated the 30th of November, 1905 is the most formally composed of the 4 documents in the dossier and in certain respects the most frustrating. The official portion of the document records that Thomas Henderson, 17, of the Henderson Farm north of Potlatch, reported a series of livestock disturbances and a sighting of an unknown animal at the property's northern boundary. It notes that Crane dispatched his deputy the following day, that the deputy examined the property, and that the deputy's assessment was large predator, possibly be bear, possibly raid, canid, recommend trapping. The report then appends a second paragraph written in a noticeably smaller and more careful hand than the first, as if composed more slowly with greater attention to each word. The Henderson boy was precise in his description of the figure observed at the Treeline on the night of November 22nd. He described it as fully bipedal, carrying human proportions in height and limb arrangement, with a head he could not characterize clearly at the distance, but which he stated was incorrect in shape. His word was incorrect. He was not a nervous young man. His account did not change in any detail across 2 separate conversations. I have included it here because I believe accurate record-keeping requires it. My deputy proposed that the boy had observed a man, a vagrant, or an early-season trapper who had wandered close to the property. I do not believe this explanation accounts for the physical evidence, specifically the fence posts, the stride measurement, or the damage pattern at the barn and hen house. I have not recorded an official conclusion, because I do not have one that fits all the facts before me. Crane visited the property himself on the 1st of December, accompanied only by a young man who worked in his office. His official records contain nothing from this visit, but Veitch obtained from Crane's daughter during a 1922 interview a personal memorandum the sheriff had written on the evening of his return, a document never intended for official filing, composed apparently for his own record. The memorandum describes with the flat precision of a man trained to observe the physical evidence at the northern fence line. The impressions in the packed snow were not consistent with any animal I have working knowledge of. The stride length between successive impressions, which Crane measured with a carpenter's rule he carried in his coat pocket, was consistently between 56 and 60 inches. For reference, he notes, a running man of 6 feet would produce approximately 48 in of stride. The Henderson impressions were not running strides. They were the settled even spacing of a creature walking at leisure, producing a stride that no human gait could replicate without a structural difference in the hips and lower limbs. Crane also noted at the end of the memorandum a smell. There is an odor at the Treeline that I cannot account for. He writes, it is not the smell of a dead animal which I know well. It is not purely an animal smell at all, or at least not any animal I have encountered. The closest approximation I can manage is this: standing water in a cold stone place and pine resin, and something beneath both of those things for which I have no language. I smelled it for as long as I stood at the Treeline. When I stepped back into the open field, it was gone. When I returned to the Treeline, it returned. It belongs to that place. Professor Harmon Veitch's notes end abruptly only a few pages after the final testimony included in this dossier. The darker blue ink that marks his editorial hand becomes noticeably sparse toward the end of the manuscript, as though the professor himself had grown reluctant to linger over the final implications of the Henderson case. His last recorded remark appears in the margin beside Sheriff Crane's memorandum, describing the smell at the Treeline. It consists of a single sentence: certain presences are not bound to movement alone. Some appear to claim a boundary and weight. No additional explanation follows. The Henderson family did not remain on the property through the winter. County land records confirm that the farm north of Potlatch was vacated in the early weeks of December 1905. A neighbor reported seeing the Henderson wagon moving south along the frozen road shortly after the first heavy snowfall. The house, barn, and surrounding acreage were left standing but unoccupied. By the spring of the following year, the land had already begun to return to neglect. No formal record exists of any subsequent investigation. Sheriff Aldous Crane did not file an official addendum to his incident report. His personal memorandum, recovered years later by Professor Veitch, is the only indication that he revisited the matter privately. Crane served as sheriff of Latta County for another 12 years and was not known to have spoken publicly about the Henderson property again. Thomas Henderson's statement, written in 1923 at Veitch's request, concludes with a brief paragraph that the professor chose to reproduce without comment. People always ask why we left. The truth is that leaving was not the hard part. The hard part was realizing that whatever was standing out there in the trees did not look surprised to see us go. It watched us the same way it watched the house, as if time did not matter to it, and as if it knew the land would still be there when we were gone. The Henderson homestead was eventually reclaimed by forest growth. Latest surveys of the region conducted in the 1930s show no permanent settlement remaining on the site. The northern boundary where the old fence line once stood now lies within an uninterrupted stretch of ponderosa pine. Professor Veitch closed the file with a short summary written on the inside cover of the dossier. Whether the Henderson case represents a misidentified animal, a cultural misunderstanding, or something less easily categorized cannot be determined from the surviving evidence. What can be stated with certainty is that every witness described the same pattern: the watching, the deliberate pacing, and the fixed position at the tree line before dawn. Whatever was present on that ridge in the winter of 1905 behaved less like a passing predator and more like a resident observer. The dossier was never formally published, and the ridge above the Henderson property remains, to this day, largely unsurveyed.